Good morning, fifth graders. Today I'd like to talk about when to multiply or divide when you are doing a word problem. Now, to do this, there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. First of all, we're looking at the chart that's in front of you. You need to know what it is that you are doing when you are multiplying. When you multiply, you are finding groups of. For example, you have 3 times 4, which means that you are finding 3 groups of 4, or 4 plus 4 plus 4. The word problem example is last year 135 cows on Dixie's dairy farm had calves. This year, 6/10 times that many cows had calves. How many cows had calves this year? In this example, we are finding 6/10 of 135, or 6/10 times 135. Now, when you divide, this is a different operation. You are starting with a total number and finding equal groups. So in our easier example, we have 12 divided by 3. Start with a total of 12 and make equal groups of 3. Our word problem example is a box contains 1 and 2/10 pounds of cereal. A serving weighs 8/10 of a pound. How many servings are in the box? In this example, you are starting with a total of 1.2 pounds of cereal and finding equal groups of 8/10. The problem might be visualized like this. So I take 1.2 pounds and begin with that total, and then make 0.8 pounds for each serving that I have to make within that 1.2 pounds. So now that we've talked about what it means to actually multiply and divide, I would like to point out that there are some rules that you need to know when you are doing multiplication and division with decimals. The rules are circled in red. When you multiply a decimal less than 1, you will end up with less than what you started with. Fifth graders, this should sound familiar to you because this is the same rule that applied when you multiplied fractions. If you started with one fraction and multiplied with a fraction less than 1, then you would have ended up with less than what you started with. The same applies when you multiply a decimal. Likewise, when you multiply a decimal larger than 1, you will end up with more than what you started with. So I have the rules posted again for when you multiply with a decimal less than 1 or a decimal larger than 1. But what happens when you divide by a number less than 1? When you divide by a number less than 1, you will end up with more because you are dividing the number into parts less than the whole. For example, if I start with 3 wholes divided by 5/10, I'm going to start with a number line. I divided each whole, or the one whole, into 10/10, and I'm going to circle 5 of them. Now, if I do that for each number between 0 and 3, I'm going to find that I have 6 parts that are equal to 5/10, meaning that when I divide 3 by 5/10, I'm going to end up with 6. So again, I have the rules that we've talked about when multiplying and dividing by decimals in the box. I do have one more scenario to present to you, and that is when you divide by a number greater than 1. When you divide by a number greater than 1, you're going to end up with less than what you started with because you're dividing parts greater than the whole. For example, I have 3 divided by 1 and 5/10, which for all intents and purposes is the same as 1 and a half. So if I'm going to divide this number line with 3 wholes on it by 1 and a half, I am making groups of 1 and a half and seeing how many groups there are. So I'm going to mark 1 and a half on my number line. Here is a half in each of the holes, and then I'm going to circle 1 and a half. Here is my 1, here is the extra half. if I circle 1.5 piece or size 1.5 in 3 holes, I see that I end up with 2. So my problem that I started with, 3 divided by 1.5, is going to be 2, showing that I am ending up with something less than what I started with. So here's our first word problem. You will see that there are 3 different parts that we need to decide. We need to decide whether we are going to multiply or divide. We are going to have to decide whether the answer is going to be less than 3.6 or less than what we started with, or greater than what we started with, and then of course finding the answer. The problem says, Gus ran 3.6 miles. He took a sip of water every 9/10 of a mile. How many sips did he take? So we need to decide whether we are finding groups of, or if we are taking a total and making equal groups. In this case, we are starting with 3.6, and every 9/10 of a mile, we have to take a sip of water. So that might look like starting with 3.6 and then making those equal groups, which means that we will be dividing. So we will write divide in the first blank. The next question will the answer be greater or less than 3.6, which is what we are starting with. Remembering back to what we just talked about, you will remember that when you divide by a decimal less than 1, you are ending up with a greater answer. So our answer we can expect to be greater than 3.6. So we will write greater in our answer. Now to solve. We know that we are starting with 3.6 and we are dividing by 9/10. Of course, now you see that there is a decimal point in the divisor and a decimal point in the dividend. Knowing what we know about moving those decimal points to create whole numbers, we are going to move this decimal point over one place to make it a whole number 9. And then in the dividend, we will move it also one more place because we moved it one place in the divisor. So now we are essentially ending up with 9 into 36, which of course 9 into 36 is 4. Gus will take 4 sips of water if he runs 3.6 miles and takes a sip of water every 9/10 of a mile. So here is our second example. A turtle walks 2/10 of a mile in 1 hour. How far can it walk in 5/10 of an hour? We need to decide, are we going to multiply or divide to solve? So are we finding groups of, or are we starting with a total and making equal groups? In this case, we are starting with 2/10 and finding 5/10 of those 2/10, finding groups of. So in this case, we will be multiplying. Other than trying to write the word multiply in that box, I will just simply put the multiplication sign. Next, will the answer be more or less than 2/10? If you remember what we just talked about, we know that it is going to be less than, because when you multiply a number by a decimal less than 1, we end up with less. Now to solve our problem. We know that we are starting with 2/10. We know that we need to find 5/10 of those 2/10. So your multiplication problem then is going to look like this. 5/10 groups of 2/10, or 5/10 times 2/10. Write that vertically. And I see that 5 times 2 equals 10. Of course, 2 times 0 is 0. We don't need to write that down. And we don't need to write down 0 times 5 and 0 times 0. However, we do have a decimal point, and I know that if I look at the number of places to the right of the decimal point, I have 2 places to the right of the decimal point. So then I count 1, 2 places to the right of the decimal point, and then put my decimal point in front of those 2 places. So my answer then becomes 1/10, or you could write it 10/100ths. Since we have our answer, or our problem rather, in tenths, I would stick with tenths. So remember, 5th graders, when doing today's assignment, remember 2 things: the difference between multiplication and division, and then also keep these rules about what you end up with when you multiply or divide by a decimal in front of you. That way you can answer the questions more easily.